Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Does morality have a role to play in statecraft and foreign policy? Should states' foreign policy decision-making be a function of moral reasoning, or do ends justify the means? There has been a great deal of debate in India in the recent past about the moral dilemma in engaging the Taliban in Afghanistan, given its reprehensible moral character and behavior. So are there organizations and individuals in the external environment that states like India should try and not engage, given their morally questionable character? Take the case of the Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed. These two terrorist organizations have killed scores of Indian citizens in the past. Should India, hypothetically speaking, engage them in a ceasefire deal, should there be an opportunity? Or would you say that is too reprehensible? Moral questions are not easy to resolve. So I have with me Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan to answer some of these complex moral questions relating to foreign policy and statecraft. Rajesh is a professor of international politics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He is the author of Fighting Like a Guerrilla, the Indian Army and Counterinsurgency, and Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia. So, Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, welcome back to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Happy to be here.
Professor Rajagopalan, in a recent piece for the print, you made the argument that Indo-US relationship should not be burdened with Afghanistan or issues like democracy in India under Modi, which in your opinion would be a diversion from the primary objective, which is Indo-US cooperation to counter China. Is it not a narrow view in some sense of Indo-US relations, because democracy is often repeated as a major, part of Indo-US relationship, or is it merely a rhetoric couching the interest that the two sides have in the region or abroad?
Yeah, I think it is. I would argue that it is more rhetoric than really the central facet of the relationship. Yes, we have repeatedly talked about democracy, and so it is natural that people, when they look at the US-India relationship, they focus on the democracy part, because both India as well as the US particularly, but also India, have talked about how these are two democracies and the world's largest and the world's oldest democracy, and so on and so forth. We have done that since from the beginning, but especially over the last since 1998, after 1998, we have been emphasizing that aspect. So it's only natural that analysts and others focus on that aspect. But I think we need to recognize that despite the fact that the governments talk about democracy, that is not the primary reason why US and India have come together. Democracy has very little to do with why India and the US are now, their relations are deepening with every passing month. Democracy has nothing to do with it, because obviously we have been a democracy since 1947. US has been, of course, also been a democracy, but that has never been the reason for our relationship. It is only now that India and the US have come quite close. If you go back to the Cold War period, for example, we were still democracies, but we were on the opposite sides of the Cold War. India was, despite the fact that we are democracies, we were not an ally of the United States. We were not even aligned with the United States. Forget a formal military alliance, but not even in an informal alliance, informal alignment did we have with the United States, except for brief periods in the late 50s, early 60s, when we had the difficulty with China. Even that clearly after 71, that ended entirely. The democracy part has not been a factor in much of US-India relations. It's only it's only in the recent past that India and US have come close, and that closeness does not correlate with any aspect of the democracy part at all. I mean, so if we were democracies, if democracy was the glue, was a reason for us to come together, we should have been allies since 1947, and we haven't. Both on their side as well as on our side, I think we had other interests that either drove us apart or brought us closer.
You argue that it is not prudent for US-India ties to be burdened with the prevention of democratic backsliding under Modi. But for the longest time, India has been seen as a democratic counter to China. So will the erosion of democracy, in your opinion, inside India not undermine its position as a liberal bulwark against the authoritarian China, at least in the domain of ideas in the sort of liberal international order, as it were?
Yeah, I think that aspect of democratic India as a counterweight to China, to authoritarian communist China, was something that was a framing that was done by the United States in the 1950s and to some extent the 1960s. But of course, once they had their opening to China after 1971, that framing was disappeared, and that goes back to what we were discussing previously, which was about the importance of democracy. That the democracy was not sufficiently important for them as soon as the purpose was served, as soon as they had their opening to then India no longer was important, and that framing itself almost entirely disappeared. Now, we haven't, even though we have gotten closer over the last decade and a half, it hasn't been framed as democracy versus Chinese authoritarianism. It has more been framed as Chinese aggressiveness and the need to sort of counter China. The notion of democracy has come in only in the context of US and India being democracies, and that providing some sort of a basis for the relationship, but not in terms of India being a democratic counter to an authoritarian China. So that is, that I think that element may have a role to play, but I don't think it has been framed in that respect, and definitely not in the sense that it was framed in the 50s and 60s, when that was, you're right, that was a framing, but that disappeared. That did not have much. That did not have much of an impact on India. Of course, India did not frame it in that respect. It was the United States that framed it in that respect, and we did not sort of entirely go along with that framing. But even the American framing of that issue changed after 1971, because basically that completely disappeared from their vocabulary also. So I don't think that there is that framing itself. I don't see it very much in evidence today. That framing is only in terms of the fact that US and India are democracies, and therefore that provides some sort of a basis, common basis for our relationship, but not in terms of China per se.
But I think there is an interesting talk about the Quad being a coming together of democracies: US, India, Japan, Australia. So we can show the authoritarian Chinese how democracies can come together and beat back authoritarianism and human rights violations. There is that talk. I mean, either it is an argument from hypocrisy, or it means something. But the talk is nevertheless there.
Yeah, so we have seen some discussion, especially in the early weeks, I wouldn't even say months, but the early weeks of the Biden administration about a democratic alliance and a democracy, some form of a democratic grouping, D10 and so on and so forth. But that is they have kind of gone soft on that, essentially because they recognize themselves, I think, that framing it in that manner is problematic, considering that a lot of their potential allies or partners all around Indo-Pacific can't really be included in that grouping. I mean, Vietnam, for example, it's not really. Vietnam is an important part of that potential emerging coalition, but it can hardly be characterized in terms of a democracy. And so this becomes a little bit of a problem for the United States if if they go down that path. And so I think we have seen a softening of that element of democracy being the glue that holds these countries together. I mean, obviously, countries do talk about democracy. I think, I mean, we are, all of us, India, US, Japan, Australia, others, are all democracies of whatever the internal differences and difficulties that many of these polities have. But we are fundamentally democracies, and so it is natural that that some of that talk comes up. But there is a certain amount of hypocrisy, as you said, clearly, because India hasn't had any qualms about aligning with all sorts of regimes throughout the Cold War. For example, we hardly had any democratic partners or democratic countries that were friendly to us. In fact, most of the democracies around the world, we had very cool relationship with. I mean, it wasn't even a particularly warm relationship. I mean, if we talk about Australia or Japan or even the European countries, most of the European countries. I mean, we sort of saw them not because their democracies weren't strong, but because we saw them somehow as allies of the United States, and therefore somehow puppets of the United States, and somehow therefore something less than a full sovereign state. And that framing was quite common during the Cold War when we looked at those countries. So our relationship with many of these countries, with many of the democracies, with almost all of them, was not exactly warm. Whereas the warmest relationship that we had were with some of the most brutal and undemocratic, and totalitarian and authoritarian regimes around the world. I mean, beginning with China, obviously, in the 50s, but also the Soviet Union, and all of our non-aligned friends. None of them would be characterized as democratic. None of them were democracies. So in a sense of it, I don't think that was ever an issue. But we do. It is democracy is important because we are a democracy, and so therefore we would like to frame our interest in terms of that democracy. But there is obviously a significant amount of hypocrisy involved in that, because it's ultimately our self-interest that matters much more than our whether we are a democracy or not a democracy.
But let's broaden the scope of the conversation a little further. And in that context, let's talk a little more conceptually about morality and statecraft. So in your opinion, does morality matter at all in foreign policy, in the pursuit of foreign policy and statecraft?
Yeah, I think morality is important in how, not so much in terms of how states actually behave, but how states see themselves, right? I mean, so states do not see themselves as immoral or amoral even. States do see themselves as moral, as moral in particular aspects. But their behavior would not always fit within that moral framework. So every state, even all the states that do all kinds of horrible stuff internationally to other states, to other communities, all frame it as some sort of a moral pursuit. And we can go back to, for example, European colonialism. European expansionism was justified repeatedly as Europe bringing the benefits of civilization to the rest of the world, right? I mean, so the white man's burden, for example. One of the most brutal colonial imperial regimes was the Belgian, right, in Congo. It was enormous amount of brutality that is in fact inflicted on the Congolese. But the Belgians sort of saw themselves as doing good, and they even constructed a museum that celebrated their achievements, right? So I mean, so the states do not see themselves as doing something bad. I mean, there are countless other examples, obviously, but states always want to see themselves as doing good, and therefore they would always provide some sort of a moral cover on their own behavior, and that has been, like, they colonial example.
I get the point about, I get the distinction that you're making between objective morality and subjective morality. But be that as it may, there are certain, I mean, whether we like it or not, there are certain global standards of what moral behavior entails, be it democracy, human rights, respecting human rights of citizens, not mass murdering your way into power, freedom of speech, etc., etc. So that may be subjective, and yet, so they constitute a certain moral character or behavior. But you are saying there is a distinction between self-perception and behavior. Let's talk about behavior itself. Does morality matter in the behavior of states as well?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's so even though states would like to see themselves as moral actors, their behavior often is not. And so, and this is well known in the sense that even, for example, a constructivist scholar like Madhav Vinamo talks about the necessity of hypocrisy. Right? I mean, states have to engage in some level of hypocrisy, and of course, the more power you have, the more hypocrite you will be. But the point is that all states will engage in some level of hypocrisy. I mean, you shouldn't obviously engage in enormous amount of hypocrisy because nothing you say will be taken seriously. But states have no choice but to engage in hypocrisy, right? I mean, so that is not something that is unusual, and that is, in fact, I would say that's a rule that most states, if they could, they would obviously act, they would behave morally, right? I mean, but most of the time, states are faced with choices where there is no moral, where the moral choice there would not be the right choice in terms of national interest, in terms of state interest, right? I mean, because of that, they would not have that, they would be given a choice between pursuing their self-interest and pursuing a moral course. They would always pick, or more often than not, they would pick the self-interest.
Right. So, in other words, you're saying that it is not as if morality never matters, but morality there is. So, it sometimes matters, sometimes it doesn't, and that depends on the national interest at stake. Have I got that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, if the national interest coincides with moral objective, for example, U.S. Going into Somalia, right? I mean, the purpose and what the U.S. did was good moral sort of pursuit for preventing famines in the 1990s. But then that quickly, once certain cost came to be associated with it, the U.S. decided that it was no longer worth the trouble. So morality, as long as morality, the moral pursuit come without cost, yes. But if the moral pursuit involves cost to their interests, then states are not going to do that. And so most of the times, it does involve moral. It does involve other kinds of costs, and so states will not have the capacity to sort of engage in moral action.
So, in other words, if I may paraphrase you, correct me if I'm wrong. So, you're saying there is a certain order of moral priorities, right? First comes interest and then morals. So, does it mean then that morals is a matter of pure convenience?
Yeah, I mean, one could say that morals are a matter of convenience in the sense that if there is nothing else standing in the way, of course, we will pursue moral concerns. And I mean, we can, it's not just others. We do this all the time. When we were discussing this earlier, I mentioned to you the example of the nuclear test ban, right? I mean, for decades, we said nuclear test ban, it goes back to Nehru, whatnot. Very, very moral, very, very upright position that we took. Very strict position that we took. When the nuclear test ban actually came, we suddenly realized that our self-interest was involved, right? I mean, when the comprehensive test ban really came up, we of course came up with all kinds of excuses, but that is of course the only time also Ambassador to the Ghost at Rombo talked about national security. Right? So said, we can't do this because it's not in our interest. I mean, so very rare for India to do that, to explicitly say that, but that tells you something about where the relationship between morality and self-interest, because for all the decades when the test ban treaty was not something that is likely to happen, we kept saying test ban treaty, right? I mean, once that actually was on the cusp of happening, on the cusp of being accomplished, we suddenly looked at what that would mean for our own nuclear weapons program and decided that's not in our interest, right? I mean, so it is a matter of convenience. If it is no cost, yeah, we will do it.
Right, let's extend that logic a little further. If morality, as you say, has no place in statecraft, at least when states' national interest is at stake, is it okay, therefore, to use, for example, terrorism as a tool of statecraft, or not?
I mean, is it right or wrong? I'm not getting into whether it's right or wrong, but states do it all the time. Again, we have done it.
No, I want a judgment from you, a judgment call. How do you say? Is that reprehensible, morally reprehensible, or is that all right?
If there is if states will do what states will do. I mean, my own sense is that if it has to be done, it has to be done. There is nothing. You can't really be. You can't really say that you will not do something simply because it's not, it's as you said, reprehensible. I mean, again, there are variations of terrorism and sort of, what sort of terrorism am I talking about? So we have supported various groups that can be characterized as terrorist groups, for example, NTT and various Tamil groups come to mind immediately. Call them, insurgents or terrorists. But the LTT definitely was a terrorist group, which at various points of time we had supported. So, it's not, is that kind of action reprehensible? In some senses, it is, because you're using agents to randomly kill people. I mean, that is not something that is morally. That doesn't fit in any sort of moral universe, but states do that, and I think sometimes we don't have a choice but to do that. Would that mean that you should fly planes? You support a group that is engaging in nuclear terrorism or using chemical weapons or something like that? I wouldn't want to. I mean, my personal sentiment would be against it, but I don't think that is how states see it.
So in other words, the purest form of national interest could potentially justify state-sponsored terrorism.
It does, in the sense that I don't know whether it does all kinds of. That doesn't provide a justification for every kind of action, right? I mean, it's not like you can justify anything under national interest. Sometimes the cost of those kinds of actions are greater than whatever else you might lose by not pursuing that, right? So, for example, if you engage with a terrorist group that engages in chemical warfare, the cost, there are costs to that also, and it will rebound on you. There will be a blowback for those kinds of actions, and that those costs will probably be higher than whatever else you are giving up by supporting that. So I would say that the costs of immoral action also has to be calculated, or amoral action also has to be calculated. And so a lot of time states would not engage in that kind of action precisely because the cost of those kinds of immoral or amoral actions would be too high, right? I mean, so so the US, for example, has stopped various kinds of actions that the CIA used to engage in after the 1970s, partly because these things come out, then there is a blowback, there's all kinds of difficulties, and it undermines your own national interest. So states are also prudent and careful in terms of how they do even those kinds of actions. So it is not like saying, okay, I want to, this particular leader is a problem, therefore I'm going to send a terrorist group and blow up his convoy or her convoy. We saw that in Lebanon, and that came with enormous cost to both Iran and Syria, right? Because that once you start engaging in those kinds of actions, there are international repercussions. So that is self-defeating, right? I mean, and so I wouldn't say that any kind of action is justifiable, because there are also costs associated with those kinds of things.
Provided the state has taken on board those costs and say, all right, it's still in our interest to do it. Right. You've written a lot about Pak-sponsored terrorism, for example, in India, in Jammu and Kashmir in particular. So your objection to Pak-sponsored terrorism, let's say, is not moral. Your objection to Pak-sponsored terrorism against India is an argument from national interest.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, I perfectly understand why Pakistan would engage in terrorism. I mean, as a state, as a much weaker state, Pakistan would engage in asymmetrical tactics. And that is one of those asymmetrical tactics. Terrorism is one of those asymmetrical tactics. I can perfectly understand Pakistan is rational, just as I can perfectly understand why Pakistan would build nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. I mean, so a lot of Pakistani behavior has been understandable. I don't think I've ever criticized Pakistani behavior per se. I've criticized Indian response to Pakistan. Right? Indian behavior is, for me, quite inexplicable and quite difficult to understand. I don't have a problem understanding Pakistani behavior per se. Right? I mean, I doubt that I ever written that what Pakistan is doing is unjustified. Right? I mean, they can engage in that asymmetrical action precisely because they are the weaker power. But as a stronger power, India has various options that India has not exercised, right? And so India can escalate, for example. And so I've repeatedly argued that India should escalate to Pakistan's use of terrorism. So while I understand that from a purely rational perspective of Pakistan, Pakistan as an asymmetrical power, what I don't understand is why India does not respond to that, right? So that part is, all of my criticism has been about Indian response, not about Pakistani behavior. Right? And most of my, I doubt that I've ever said that Pakistan shouldn't do that. I mean, there is one way in which I think Pakistani behavior is self-defeating. That is what I mentioned earlier, that there are costs associated with these kinds of actions. And so being known as a center of terrorism and so on and so forth becomes, that those costs, I think, are not ultimately have created a problem for Pakistan. But also the other problem that in terms of a purely rational approach, I would, for anybody who's interested, I would recommend Paul Kapoor's book on Jihad, the strategy. Was a fascinating work and exactly looking at that, which is that, Pakistan hasn't really achieved much with it, right? I mean, so tactics and strategies, you have to sort of look at what you achieve. India, even during the worst periods of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism against India, India continued to grow. The gap between India and Pakistan widened, and what was achieved in terms of their strategy. I mean, so it seems to be at best some kind of psychic satisfaction at seeing yourself, right? I mean, that is not really sufficient. So in that respect, I would criticize.
Right. Let me come from a different perspective. Are there organizations or individuals in the external environment that states should try and not engage given their morally reprehensible character or behavior? Let me give an example.
Yeah.
In the case of Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed, they have killed scores of Indian citizens in the past. Should India, hypothetically speaking, engage them in a ceasefire deal, should there be an opportunity? Or would you say that we don't want to have any engagement with the Lashkar-e-Taiba?
No, I mean, I don't think that you can say that you shouldn't have any agreements or deals with anybody. I mean, I think you can. I mean, if there is a deal that is useful for us, I mean, in terms of them ceasing their activities and whatever else the terms of that agreement are. If the terms are sweet enough, why not? Absolutely, I don't see any group as in that sense as out of the out of bounds as far as having a dialogue with, or as far as coming to an agreement with, as long as an agreement is beneficial to India. That is, so that always has to be the basis. There is no blanket ban, I think, for any of these groups. Any group.
In other words, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, that would be distinct from my own view of those groups, like the Taliban or the Rajesh or whatever else. But I would still not say that is necessarily should mean that we shouldn't talk to them or whatever.
In other words, as a realist, you would not complicate your strategic reasoning with your personal morality.
Absolutely.
Be it a terror organization, or be it a normal state, or a state sponsor of terrorism. Another state should, let's say, for example, in our case, India should deal with them in the same amoral manner.
Absolutely. I mean, our foreign minister was the first one to greet the president of Iran, Raisi, right? The man has all sorts of human rights case against him, widely and credibly accused of all sorts of human rights violations. Is Iran itself, we talk about civilization ties and whatnot, but Iran is not exactly. We haven't ever talked about Hezbollah or Hamas as terrorist groups, despite the fact that they engage in terrorism. So yeah, I mean, the same applies to groups, the same applies to states.
Do you at all make a distinction in your analysis between, say, terror organizations, these freelancers who sort of run around doing what they do, and state sponsorship of terrorism / subconventional activity, whatever you might want to call it? Do you make a distinction at all?
Not really. I don't think there is much of a distinction. I mean, other than the fact that states are, of course, more capable, they are more durable, and there are various other variations between states and terrorist groups. But as actors, there are all different types of actors. I mean, just as you would not you would engage with other actors like multilateral organizations or private corporations and so on and so forth. So you still, terrorists are yet another actors. I mean, I yet another set of actors. It's a question of what you need or how that benefits you. I mean, that is the starting point, rather than looking at the character of a state or the character of a group or the character of a corporation or whatever else. I mean, so that is not that you don't start there. I mean, you don't start with the character. You start with your purpose, what it is, what your objectives are, and what your purpose is, and then from there, you go on to sort of look at what they can do for you. And, ultimately character may come in somewhere there, but that is not where you start.
Right. So let's take the example of Taliban. There's a lot of conversation going on today on Twitter or on TV channels about the desirability of engaging a morally reprehensible entity like the Taliban. They violate human rights. They, violate the rights of women and children, and minorities in general. And therefore, a lot of people seem to be making the argument in India today that India should not engage them because India is a morally upright country. It's a democratic country. We have our morals and traditions, etc. Where do you stand on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problems. I have objections to dealing with the Taliban, but that has nothing to do with the morality of the Taliban or lack of it. That is not the issue. I don't think that the Taliban will ever be independent of the Pakistan state. I mean, in the sense that they're independent of Pakistani agencies and so on. So I don't think the idea that you could talk and get the Taliban to support you for support us or help us pursue our interests will work. I mean, so it's purely on those pragmatic grounds that I would say forget about the Taliban because that's not going to happen. And we have been down this road many, many times before, right? I mean, since the 90s, we've been down this path. And it never worked. And I find it very difficult to believe that it will work in the future, right? And for many reasons. I mean, the fact that most the proximity between the fact that they are neighbors, we don't have direct access to them, makes it very difficult for us to give them anything. What are you going to offer? What are you going to offer Taliban?
I get your point, but let's say you have credible reason to believe that there are factions within the Taliban who are, who are also not willing to put all their eggs in the Pakistani basket, and they're looking at other opportunities. So if you have credible reason to believe that engaging them would potentially benefit you strategically, you'd go ahead and do that.
Absolutely. I mean, if you have credible reasons to believe that they would come over to help India, there is no reason why you should talk to them. I mean, that the problem is that we are having fairly good relations despite all the things that are going on in Ladakh. With the regime in China that is, by all accounts, genocide. We have a very close relationship with Russia and Putin, despite the fact that he sends agents around the world killing his opponents with poison and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so I mean, we are not making those kinds of moral judgments with China or Russia. I don't see, or Iran for that matter. I mean, so I don't see any reason why we should make those kinds of moral judgments with Taliban if they can provide us something, right? I mean, I doubt that what they can provide us. I doubt that any of the groups there can provide us anything very much, and I don't think it will be that there is a group faction within it, and they start talking to us. I mean, I think that faction will be very short-lived. I mean, given Pakistan sensitivities on that issue. So I'm very, very skeptical of the idea of that particular idea, of the idea that that the Taliban can help us pursue some interest in factions, or the Taliban as a whole will help us pursue some interest in Afghanistan.
Right.
Very skeptical.
Got it. So let's say tomorrow somebody, the Human Rights Watch or somebody in Europe, accuses India of violating human rights in Jammu and Kashmir. You wouldn't be morally outraged, right?
No, I mean, those are two different things, right? I mean, we're talking about domestic politics. We are talking about our own society as opposed to
no.
State's behavior externally.
No, you misunderstood my question. What I'm asking is that someone externally tomorrow accuses India of violating human rights within India's domestic sphere. You wouldn't be outraged by that accusation, would you be?
No, I wouldn't be outraged by that accusation because, I mean, I would obviously look at whether those accusations are valid or not. But that's, let's assume for the sake of argument that such accusations, I mean, those accusations are always made. I've always been skeptical of the kind of sort of response that they've had to these kinds of accusations. I think that's why I said that is the accusations about our domestic behavior, right? I mean, and so that is entirely distinct from our foreign behavior.
But I do understand. But just like you might say that the Iranian president is violating human rights in Iran or in China, they could turn around and say you're doing pretty much the same thing or less, or in whatever degree it may be. You wouldn't be morally outraged by that accusation. I mean, it's a different matter. You would be morally outraged by what is happening in a country, or that's a different matter.
No, but if that accusation, I mean, I would want obviously India and Indian society and Indian polity to be much better than Iran or China or Russia, or whatever else. And so if there are accusations of those of that nature, then I would take it seriously because that is different because that's an accusation about the state of our society. Right? I mean, that is something that has to be taken seriously. That is not something that can be dismissed. I mean, there's a difference between us engaging with China or Russia or Iran and us behaving the way we behave domestically. I mean, those. Okay. Or let me put it this way. Let's say Pakistan accusing India of human rights violations. Even that, I would say, we need to take seriously because those are accusations about the way our state behaves within our society, right? I mean, there may be, and we can dismiss it in terms of the veracity of that, and so that should definitely be seriously considered. But the dismissal has to be on the basis of that, not that Pakistan said it or Human Rights Watch said it or whatever else, right? I mean, because that is a fundamentally different issue when our state is accused of its behavior domestically as opposed to its behavior externally.
So when does the state interest versus morality arguments start applying internally or domestically? Or do they at all?
No.
If state right. So if state is an immoral entity, why would it apply only externally and not internally? Is it possible to make that clear?
I didn't say the state was a moral entity, right? I said states' behavior internationally in the society of states has to be, that doesn't mean the state itself is amoral or immoral. Right?
So state behavior, you say state behavior can be immoral internationally, but state behavior cannot be immoral domestically. Can you make a clear connection between these?
Yeah, absolutely. It can because we give our consent to the state to have certain authority, legitimacy, whatever. It is our power that we, in a sense, concede to the state for maintaining an ordered society. right? And therefore we have the right. The state is not, it's not an empire, it's not a king, it's not, it's not given by divine right, whatever. It is our government. And so we have a right to ask questions of our government and how that government behaves.
The state could potentially be a kingdom. The state could potentially be a monarchy. It could be
a state that's a kingdom, well, the citizens of that state will not have the kind of rights that where they would be able to question the king, right? Or if or else they will have to rebel. I mean, we are talking about a democracy in India, so within a democracy, the rights are the relationship between the state and society is different as compared to a totalitarian or an authoritarian state or a feudal state and so on and so forth. So that is those things are not comparable.
Here is my concern. Is it feasible to make a clear-cut distinction between domestic space where moral action is warranted and external space where moral action is contingent upon national interest? Is politics that uncomplicated and simple that some parts of the state can engage in, say, strategic terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, immoral action, amoral action, call it what you want, and the same state in a slightly different capacity dealing with the domestic space ends up becoming completely moral or will be moral? Is that expectation not a bit too much?
No, I don't think so, because all democracies, and we are talking only about democracies, because obviously non-democracies are not moral even in their domestic behavior. So that is, that they are not even in that in the consideration. But democracies are expected to. It's not a question of morality. I mean, because for example, even if you could question the morality of all sorts of policies domestically, right? I mean, developmental choices that you make. I mean, you build dams and that that forces people out of their homes. Is that moral? Or you build, or you do something else. You build highways, or you make taxation choices between direct tax and indirect tax. I mean, all of these involve. One could make accusations about morality, but I would say that is not the that it is not a question of morality. Domestically, it's somewhat different. When you talk about internationally, in a society of states where there is nobody to govern, and where we're familiar with these terms, but which is a self-help system where every state is basically left to itself. There is no global government, so every state has to fend for itself, and therefore some of these tactics and tools become necessary occasionally. I mean, it's not like every state is always engaged in immoral behavior, but democracy is definitely not, and so you would have to expediency sometimes requires that you engage in some kinds of behavior in the international realm, in the society of states. But domestically, that is not it is not you are not expecting states to do that. I mean, not all states. I mean, democracies, you're not expecting that. So that is, those two things are. I mean, I wouldn't even, so the domestic part, I wouldn't even say moral behavior. States are supposed to exercise authority constrained by the laws and constitutions and things like that, right? I mean, so as long as they exercise authority within those constraints, and that can be challenged, obviously, in courts of law and things like that. And so that it is not a question of morality, again, because morality gets into all sorts of other problems, because all policy choice involve some sort of moral issues. But whether states act within the bounds of the constitution and the laws and things of that kind, which we decided, right? I mean, which as a society we decided that these have to be the rules and laws.
Right.
So that is a right question to ask of domestic behavior, not morality.
Well, states are, societies are driven by moral principles, moral standards. They aspire for several, moral righteous behavior. So morality is part of the conversation. In any case, that's something that we can't rule out. I'll tell you where my problem is. The clear-cut distinction that you're making between domestic space where moral action is warranted and the external space where moral action is contingent upon national interest seems to be an ideal sort of a situation. Seems to be an ideal a sort of clean break, as it were,
Ideal type, yeah.
Which may not necessarily function in real life, and that's the problem. Let's take the example of the recent controversy surrounding the Pegasus software, right? I mean, all right, Israelis sell that state software to states only for what? For mostly to keep a tab on terrorists and adversaries and enemies, that is and the other. But the opposition in India is accusing the government of tapping the phones of its own citizens. So are we? I mean, strictly speaking, therefore, from a quote unquote moral behavior point of view, that's not what you're seeing. So I know what you the counter that could potentially be, states shouldn't behave like that. But the reality is that if you're used to behaving in a particular way in a site, in a different site, you can't expect the same Leviathan to behave in a different way, or can you?
Yeah, so that's a danger. I mean, that's definitely a danger. And so the answer to that is what you said, which is that if you engage in that kind of behavior, that's illegal behavior, right? I mean, so that's what I said, within the bounds of the constitution and the rules and the laws and things like that is how you're supposed to behave. But that is always a danger. So whenever a state engages in that kind of action domestically, obviously it's going beyond the legal norms, the constitution, the rules, whatnot, and they can be taken to court, and they should be taken to court, and they should be they should be forced to sort of account for that kind of behavior, unlike in the international law. But you are right about this, about the seepage, as it were, from the kind of behavior that you engage in internationally to the kind of behavior that you engage in domestically, right? If you engage in some kinds of behavior internationally that has effects on domestic society, you may engage in that kind of behavior domestically also. That is a danger in all democracies, right? I mean, that's been the case throughout history with all democracies. There's one reason why the US makes some very clear distinctions about where the CIA is supposed to operate, right? Where even a number of our parliamentarians have repeatedly said that our intelligence agency should come under legislation, there should be sort of a framework, a legal framework for their operations and so on and so forth. So that seepage is always a problem. That's what we mean by militarization, right? I mean, for example, the fact that you engage in intense competition with other countries, that tends to militarize a society, because your international behavior has a domestic effect, a kind of another kind of blowback effect on a domestic society. We always have to be on guard against that, but that danger is not something that can be ruled out. And you're right to point out that danger, but that is still it's a danger that one needs to contain. It is not something that the fact that that's the kind of blowback happens in democracies is not to say that there is no distinction. The fact that we resist that itself points to that distinction, right? I mean, I do the same thing in the US with all the Patriot Act and things like that. And so all sorts of behavior when in great danger you engage in behavior internationally that does have all kinds of domestic blowback. But that is not, that if you're a good democracy, if you're a strong liberal democracy, then you will find that those kinds of actions domestically would be resisted, right? I mean, and it would be resisted, and the system will correct itself to make sure that those kinds of, those are always excesses, right? I mean, those are always things that were unintended, and that would always be controlled.
I do understand the distinction that you make between the domestic space and the external space. I mean, one is governed by rules, regulation, arbitration, laws, etc. The other is not. Let's say there is today an emergence of a global, legal framework in certain spheres of life, be it laws of war, the arrival of ICC, ICJ, the outlawing of certain kinds of weapon systems, etc., etc. You're looking at a slow, steady emergence of a global standardization of how states should behave, etc. So, if indeed there is an emergence of this so steady order, as it were, at what point do these global morals or standards apply to states? Do they apply? Should they apply at all?
No, I don't think that it will be possible to come up with, there are come up with global rules that apply, because it's very, very difficult to negotiate those global rules as to what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. And we see a lot of that happening now, whether it's internet rules or whatever else. How are we going to, who frames this? Right? I mean, how do we come up with these global rules? I mean, there has to be, if 200 states sit together, they're not going to decide on anything. Right? I mean, so it's going to be very, very difficult, I would think, that to come up with those kinds of rules. So the rules that we have are very thin at the, at best. I mean, even the rules about genocide, if the states don't follow it, then there is nothing that the international community can do about it. I mean, we're talking about the most minimal level of individual rights, of the right to life, and even that is being violated, and without much response from the international community. So I would be extremely skeptical that we'll be able to frame anything broader than those kinds of rules. Those kinds of rules can be framed only in the context of some sort of a hegemonic system where there is a, where there is a global power that is dominant power, whether it is the US or China in the future or whatever. Then that global hegemon can sort of frame rules for everybody and say, okay, everybody has to behave according to these rules. And that might work, but outside of that, the idea that 200 odd states can sit together and decide what is appropriate for all states, I find it extremely difficult. So when you say ICJ, or when you say rules against certain, some norms, which norms? I mean, even landmines, for example, indiscriminate use of landmines, or none of these are have been accepted by the strong states. And so they remain, they are not really fully formed laws that other states have, or that all states have accepted for definitely for the domestic matter, for the domestic in terms of the domestic rules.
Take a look at weapons, for example. I mean, you have an example right there. You're right. I mean, in the case of landmines, there is no, even India has no signed on to it, but you have chemical weapons, for example, or certain conventional weapons. I mean, there is an emerging sort of trend towards codifying some of these. I mean, say, compared to 100 years ago. So we are not probably in that. I mean, what I'm trying to basically say is that I understand the argument of self-help and anarchy as it were. But is it the same as, say, it was 100 years ago, 150 years ago, as it is today? That's no,
I think there are some rules that may have evolved, as rules of sovereignty, for example, right? I mean, the right not to be ruled or governed by others. But all of that was accompanied by what might be characterized as a democratization of violence, which made it more difficult for foreign powers to occupy other countries and so on. So even that is not entirely the consequence of of any kind of a common value. That is kind of a norm that evolved over a period of time. But outside of that, really speaking, outside of the rules of sovereignty, what really is there? I mean, chemical weapons, one could make a very good argument that chemical weapons, there hasn't been any recent progress. I mean, chemical weapons have been concerned since the First World War, but not much progress except for the CWC. Okay, formally was accepted, but again, during the early days of unipolarity, when the US was able to knock heads together to make sure that others didn't sort of go down that path, right? I mean, so that itself was a function of hegemonic power. And we see that being violated now, whether in Syria or other places, without any punishment, without anybody doing anything about it, right? I mean, so really speaking, what are these rules? I mean, there aren't very many rules that we can think about, which the international community, either in a normative sense or in a formal legal sense, has framed that is accepted and applied domestically. Chemical weapons, other factor in chemical weapons is, of course, the effectiveness question is also important to prepare. One reason why most countries have, of course, accepted chemical weapons is that it's not particularly effective. I mean, it's not really, it is, I wouldn't say it's not effective at all. It's effective against civilians, but as a weapon of war against other forces, it is not particularly effective, right? I mean, so it became somewhat easier for a lot of countries to give that up. especially if he had other sort of weapons. So in a sense that I think there is a reason why some of these things came about, like chemical weapons ban and so on, chemical weapons convention. But part of it had to do with national self-interest, but a lot of it is also a question of who actually follows them. And there's nobody really following them, nobody enforcing them.
You spoke about the democratization of war and sovereignty, and this democratization of war somehow has prevented states from engaging in wars and occupation of the kind that used to happen earlier on. Now, on the question of sovereignty, now, how do you explain the willingness of some states to give up their sovereignty up to a point today? I have in mind the European Union, of course. I'm not saying that the argument is not that they have entirely given up on their sovereign claims, but there is a willingness to give some hitherto sovereign functions to a supranational entity, as it were. So is that the way in which the international system is developed, moving towards, given that that is only a say 50, 60-year-old sort of phenomenon, or do you think that is an aberration?
I mean, as of now, clearly that would appear to be an aberration, because we haven't seen any sort of transfer of sovereignty or even some notion of shared sovereignty in other regions, right? I mean, even in ASEAN, it's a completely different sort of set of manner in which that ASEAN came about, and the manner in which states interact within ASEAN is very, very different. And there's a long debate between scholars of ASEAN and scholars of the European Union, and about the purpose of the integration, about the manner of the integration, so on and so forth. So that's a whole debate about that. So outside of Europe, you really don't have that. And even in Europe, I think one of the key issues, two key issues. One is the fact that they face a common threat in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and that sort of made them a single, that sort of brought them together because they perceived a common threat. Whatever the nature of the threat, I'm not getting into, but they perceived a common threat which forced them to unite. The second part of it is that their security itself was largely taken care of by the United States, right? I mean, in the sense that they didn't have to worry about each other. France and Germany did not have to worry about each other. Germany and Britain did not have to worry about each other, because, all of them was the United States. And so, then that's a peculiar situation that doesn't exist anywhere else, right? I mean, maybe that'll develop in Asia over a period of time, but this was a peculiar situation where the United States was providing that, when they say security community, it's not a community really, it is the United States that is providing security. And so what normally states had to do, which is protect themselves, did not for a period of time, states did not have to do in Europe. And therefore they didn't have to worry about each other as much. And they still don't worry. I mean, at the end when Germany was being reunited, the French were extremely concerned. Right? I mean, go back and look at the internal arguments and debates between the French within France and between France and US and Germany and so on. There was a lot of concern in France about German reunification. I mean, there's not the old saying about keeping Germany divided, and sort of like Germans so much that we want two of them. So that sort of so there were peculiarities in the European situation that allowed some of that to happen, and we will have to wait and see whether that evolves in other parts of the world. I'm skeptical that same set of circumstances will be available in other parts. Europe, over a period of time, of course, has developed that habit of seeing each other as a community, right? I mean, and so that normative aspect, I'm not entirely discounting. That is definitely an important facet, which I don't think previous different gives importance to, because over a period of time, habits can form, and so it would be difficult at this time to sort of make the Germans think of the French as enemies, or make the British think of the French as enemies, things like that. So I think that there has been a cultural turn there to some extent. I mean, how solid is it? How deep is it? Let us wait and see. But I'm I'm extremely skeptical that same set of circumstances, a common enemy, a hegemon that will provide security, history, all of that, common culture, all of that will be found in another region So it's not what we're talking, it's not universal time. It is a peculiarity of one part of one corner of the world. And I'm not sure that can be replicated elsewhere.
Sure. I mean, obviously, one could make the argument that it has to start somewhere, and it has started somewhere. That's another way of looking at it. But be that as it may, I just want to quickly get your reaction. I know that we've gone on for some time. What, in your opinion, explains the logic behind the state's moral action as and when they engage in moral action? Is that out of pure self-interest?
It can be pure self-interest, but it can also be that it doesn't conflict with any pure self-interest. Right? I mean, so you can engage in moral action when it doesn't conflict with other self-interest, right? I mean, so like I said, when there was no prospect of a test ban, we were of course all for test ban. When there is no prospect of again, I'm sorry to be using all the examples from nuclear politics, but when there is no prospect for an FMCT, we will be all for an FMCT. No prospect for nuclear disarmament, we will be all for nuclear disarmament. So it's when it doesn't conflict with any of your self-interest, right? States will be no moral. I mean, there is no problem there. Or else there has to be a conjunction between your moral interest and your self-interest. Either of those two. But if your self-interest conflicts with your moral interest, or if that pursuit of that moral pursuit becomes expensive, then you're unlikely to do that.
On the question of morality, certain realists seem to be suggesting a middle path. E.H. Carr, for instance, or even others, they warn against naive dreaming in international politics on the one hand, and on the other hand, also warn against unrestrained cynicism. As a realist, do you think this middle path is the right way to look at international system?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that you should be completely cynical. The problem, I'm not saying that we should not look at anything with, or the states don't look at anything with a moral eye. States, of course, look at things with a moral eye. The problem is, of course, is that, again, to quote Martha Binamore, not to quote Martha Binamore, but to sort of refer to Martha Binamore. States don't always have that choice. I mean, so many questions that states face in terms of the choices that they have are not easy choices, and therefore the moral, even if you are a moral state in some respects, even if you want to pursue good ends and through good means, it's not always possible. So you should always, of course, have that as your objective. But for many of the reasons that you mentioned, including the seepage into domestic politics and so on and so forth, which you want to keep to the minimum. But the choices that states face is not always allow them to pursue that. So I don't object to looking at questions from a moral point of view, but I would object to letting that dictate your choices. Right? So you should start obviously with looking at the Taliban. That is a group that, considering their treatment of women and everything that they do, it's not something that I would want to engage with. But then the same can be said about the junta in Myanmar, right? I mean, but we hold our noses and we do what we have to, right? I mean, and so that is not what we would like to do. And I think that keeping that is where the moral judgment comes in. I think that we should have that moral judgment, but ultimately do what is necessary to be done if there are no other choices, if the moral choices themselves are not available.
Professor Rajagopalan, excellent insights. Always wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Professor Happymon Jacob. Always happy to be here.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.